All right, we're on. Welcome everybody to this week's edition of Popular Music Books in Process. I'm Eric Weisbard and co-organized this series along with Carl Wilson, who'll be handling the Q&A today, and Kimberly Mack. We're a collaboration between the Journal of Popular Music Studies, the Pop Conference, and IASPM US. In conference-related things, the IASPM US conference extended its deadline to November 1st. The Pop Conference deadline is November 15th, so get those proposals coming in. What else can I tell you? Our series lives on my YouTube page, so if you'd like to see any of the 50 plus back episodes, those are all out there, with the exception now of one challenged Chuck Berry song on R.J. Smith's. We'll talk about that at some point down the road. But for today, we are talking Middlebrow music and are joined by John Howland and Jack Curtis Dubowsky. John has written Hearing Luxe Pop, Glorification, Glamour, and the Middlebrow in American Popular Music. He is the professor and musicology chair at the Department of Music, the Norwegian University of Science and Technology in Trondheim, Norway. So he is joining us from Norway. Props for staying up late to talk books. Author not only of Hearing Luxe Pop, but a bunch of Duke Ellington related stuff: Ellington Uptown, Duke Ellington, James P. Johnson, and the Birth of Concert Jazz in 2009, editor of Duke Ellington Studies, Cambridge University Press, 2017. Used to edit-in-chief and co-founded the Routledge journal Jazz Perspectives, and also was a professor at Rutgers back in the day. And he notes in his bio that he's currently starting a new book project on mainstream disco, 1973 to 1979. I know of at least one attendee in our session today who's going to be hitting you up for more details on that.
Sweet.
Excellent. Jack Curtis Dabowski is a composer, author, music editor, educator, and filmmaker. He is the author and will be talking today of the book Easy Listening and Film Scoring 1948 to 1978. Before that, he wrote Intersecting Film, Music, and Queerness for Palgrave Macmillan in 2016. He is a member of the Academy of Television Arts and Sciences, the Recording Academy, the Motion Picture Editors Guild, and a fellow of the Virginia Center for the Creative Arts. He is also not on strike because things so far are working out in the production of music in Hollywood. Next week in our series, just to note it real fast, we'll be talking about French jazz, Siv Bilai, the book Django Generations, Celeste Day Moore, the book Soundscapes of Liberation, African American Music in Post-War France. But we're all about today for now. Let me encourage folks who've not been to the series before to post reactions to anything you hear during the conversation in the chat. If you have questions, put them down the minute you think of them. Carl will be noticing this and steer the Q&A afterwards, but also we share the chat text with our presenters, and it's often fun to get a chance to see what people were thinking of. And I always tell the presenters, don't read the chat. Okay, that's it for now. And I will, Carl, did I forget anything?
No, we're good.
We're good? Okay, great. I will turn it over to John and Jack. Welcome.
All right. So we had a little back and forth, decided I guess I will go first since I have the handicap of being 11 p.m. here. Let's see here, PowerPoint, share. Yeah, so I'm here to talk about Hearing Luxe Pop, published in June. As I was noting, it's 11 p.m. here in Norway, so apologies if I happen to flag as the panel progresses, but I'll do my best here. But that's also a reason why I decided to let the glamour of the images in a PowerPoint do a little work for me as well. So Hearing Luxe Pop explores a long tradition of merging pop with lush strings, big band, and symphonic instruments and markers of sophistication, glamour, and spectacle within what I call deluxe or luxe production. My historical study centers on pop shifts in timbre and sound through orchestration, arranging, production, tracing a lineage back to the 20s and then up to present. These sustained stylistic and low-high class tensions of these practices lie at the center of American pop and relate to aspirational consumer culture, marketing, image construction, and critical and audience reception, as well as discourses around sophistication, cosmopolitanism, and glamorous lifestyles. My framework is historical musicology, and the work here considers a mountain of primary sources, including manuscript score and transcribed materials. The book has a generous 34 score examples, as well as artist and archival materials, commercial recordings, outtakes, pirate multitracks, some legal, visual media, reportage and criticism, promotional materials, interviews, etc. Chapter 1, Hearing Luxe Pop, Jay-Z, Isaac Hayes, and the 6 Degrees of a Symphonic Soul, is framed by a study of hip-hop plus orchestra events with low-high culture tensions between street-level hip-hop and artist displays of luxury and status. I used Jay-Z's lavish 2006 concert at Radio City Music Hall with the Hustlers Symphony Orchestra, as well as Kanye West's 2005 late orchestration Abbey Road Studios concert with the same group. I use these to outline how these events historically, sonically, conceptually, and aesthetically map onto Luxe Pop history. There are quite strong associative connections between these sorts of bestringed hip hop events and orchestral pop that one can creatively date back to elements from even 1920 symphonic jazz, an idiom that once was disparaged as, quote, the essence of musical vulgarity and its fusion of the pretentious and commonplace. Through the associative connection game of 6 Degrees of Separation, Chapter 1 outlines Luxe production across pop history. Within sampling, recordings are inherently in an intertextual pop history dialogue via samples from Isaac Hayes' cover of Burt Bacharach's Look of Love. My example of Jay-Z's Can I Live is no exception. With these starting points, the chapter literally provides an oral associative 6 degrees map of the book to articulate the social meanings that have built up around Luxe Pop. Much of the book's music is tied to Middlebrow aesthetics. Here's a famous graphic from '49. I especially illuminate Middlebrow adjacent class aspirational popular culture, with class and especially classy understood as glamour-based adjectives, not necessarily aspirational high culture status. While often intended as an insult, Middlebrow doesn't necessarily need to be a pejorative, as the idea captures social aspirations and cultural power, as well as self-conscious sophistication, glamour, and social class. I invoke this discourse not to denigrate the music, but to provide perspective on entertainment modes of low-high image construction and to argue for less essentialized readings of Brow discourse beyond aspirations to high culture, which is what a good range of Middlebrow studies has been doing of late. Chapters 2 and 3 examine a 20s to 40s era of glorified jazz. Chapter 2, the symphonic jazz age, musical vaudeville, and glorified entertainments, explores the entertainment overlaps between the real jazz of the day and its jazzy popular music siblings. The glamorous aesthetics of the big band plus strings model of the latter, known as symphonic jazz initially, was influenced by the orchestra of Paul Whiteman. The sound permeates radio, Broadway, deluxe movie palace orchestras, and Hollywood film. Symphonic jazz arranging ideals derive from period interests in variety entertainment aesthetics and classy, sophisticated entertainments. Chapter 3, Jazz with Strings Between Jazz and the Great American Songbook, articulates how Luxe Pop trends formed commercial canons of both jazz with strings recordings and lushly orchestrated vocal recordings. Over 1940 to 45, top big bands expanded their ensembles with strings and other orchestral instruments, and soloists clamored for quasi-orchestral backgrounds following Charlie Parker's With Strings albums. These trends introduced a jazz pop idiom that juxtaposed jazz arranging textures, improvisation, and melodramatic orchestral backgrounds. They further gave birth to mood music in, for instance, Paul Weston's influential mood music albums. Chapters 4 through 8 follow post-war Luxe idioms up through the 70s. The pre-rock period canonized the Great American Songbook, an idiom now referred to often as traditional pop. This model informed trends of the early 1960s rock and roll era. Chapter 4, defining Populox, Capitol Records and the swinging early hi-fi era, studies how Capitol made its greatest pre-rock contribution to American pop through their richly orchestrated jazz-inflected recordings of the late 40s and 50s, much of which was mood music and easy listening or adjacent to those idioms. The Nat Cole essay I circulated illustrates issues in this chapter, but Capitol's crowning achievements are arguably Sinatra's albums. I adopt the term Populox, coined by Thomas Hine to characterize 50s, 60s consumer trends to describe this classy jazz pop. These idioms emerge alongside the class-focused cocktail lounge. Class, again, as employed in Variety and Billboard, connotes lifestyle, decorative, and consumer signifiers for sophistication, luxury, and glamour. The early 40s trend for what Variety called class, swank, or plush cocktail lounges included the Copacabana in New York and the Las Vegas Copa Room. Within these more prestigious venues, crooners like Sinatra or Perry Como were increasingly backed by stringed orchestras. I connect these trends to Capitol's later embrace of high fidelity technologies, from Nat Cole's orchestral pop to Nelson Riddle's swinging arrangements for Sinatra. The latter relate to the 1950s reinvention of Sinatra's image as a jet-setting jazz hip womanizer and a street-smart businessman with gangster overtones. These images intersect with period bachelor lifestyle mythologies and marketing of other orchestral jazz pop. Chapter 5, Phil Spector, early 1960s teenage symphonies and the fabulous lower middlebrow, considers how teenage rock and roll and R&B embraced Luxe adult pop aesthetics, thereby imparting new urban sophistication on youth pop. This process is heard in Spector's production of the 1963 Ronettes hit Be My Baby, through considerations of recordings and manuscripts. This chapter studies Spector's production practices alongside the fabulous image of the Ronettes. I situate these teenage symphonies in relation to lower middlebrow aesthetics, as they called it in that day, Tom Wolfe's statosphere interpretations of celebrity culture, and the glamour of the Ronettes. There are a range of easy listening trends I touch upon. For example, the co-writer of arranger Jack Nietzsche's Lonely Surfer described this instrumental to me as a, quote, giant symphonic surf record, end quote, with supposed inspirations from Henry Mancini, Wagnerian opera, and period instrumental pop, surf rock, and beat era exotica. Chapter 6, Mining AM White Gold, the 1960s MOR pop foundations of 1970s soft rock, examines how LA's Baroque pop and sunshine pop and the era's studio innovations informed the emergent early summer 1970s soft rock of the Carpenters and Bread. Central here are LA studio pop and its relation to AM Gold, a later designation of this era's middle of the road pop. These trends led to crossover between the Billboard Hot 100 and easy listening charts. Billboard even suggests that, quote, the difference between the leading rock station and the leading easy listening station today is only a matter of 7 or 8 records, circa 1970. Here I intersect again with Jack, for example, on the Holly Ridge Strings and George Martin's instrumental albums, but we offer different but complementary argumentation. In chapters 7 and 8, I outline how musical glamour, middlebrow adjacency, and entertainment were manifest in symphonic soul and early disco. Chapter 7, Isaac Hayes and hot buttered orchestral soul from psychedelic to progressive considers the messy connections between symphonic soul, sophistisoul, progressive soul, psychedelia, funk, jazz traditions in flux, and Hollywood depictions of Black culture. The chapter builds arguments concerning jazz-related textures taking on Luxe associations in the post-war era. Here too, Jack and I overlap. I was really pleased to see his work on the soulful strings and Esmond Edwards, for example, whom I also bring into focus. Centrally articulate how progressive was attached to idioms beyond our common association, progressive rock. The idea of progressive soul emerges following Hayes's 1969 Hot Buttered Soul. This idiom is said to have merged soul with large ensembles, jazz elements, lush productions, and extended arrangements. These recordings are described as Black counterparts to rock studio innovations. Such trends are one tributary to disco, the flamboyant height of Luxe pop, but disco revised pop glamour, celebrity glorification, and relations between music, materialism, and fashion. Chapter 8, From Sophistisoul to Disco, Barry White and the Fall of Luxe Pop, considers how Sophistisoul represented a glamour-inclined shift to luxuriant sweet soul with acts like Barry White's Love Unlimited Orchestra. By 1974, this sweet urbane music was recharacterized as disco. Rolling Stone's issue on the disco craze featured an expose on White that asks, what must it feel like to be the first disposable king of music? This value reversal from progressive soul pop to degraded commercialism is used to reveal how disco's glitz, glamour, middlebrow adjacency, materialism, and entertainment associations were recharacterized as its detrimental excesses. The afterword considers a range of post-disco orchestral pop with attention to retromania, to borrow from Simon Reynolds, and supposed no-brow and omnivore cultures. It further observes how many post-2000 pop music invocations of Luxe pop still give rise to associations of elevated status. In the internet era, the pop culture past is ever present in a media universe where cultural associations from pre-1970 Luxe pop still thrive. Thank you.
Jack?
Yes. Is that my cue? I go now?
I should have said something.
Yeah. Okay, no, that's great. Here I go. I wanted to first thank John, of course, and I wanted to thank Eric and Kimberly and Carl for having me. And I am just really happy to be here. And I think this little talk is going to be more looking at the forest than the trees, because the trees are all in the book. And so this is more of a broad overview. And I wanted to first show you, this is the coloring book. Can everyone see this?
Mm-hmm.
So we have this coloring book. So please, on my website, you can request a copy of this coloring book while supplies last. This is the fun thing. Okay, so right. So the big issues that I became very interested in after writing this book, or through the process of researching writing in this book, include and start with authenticity versus artifice. which became this recurring theme in the book. Another one, which is related, of course, is art versus commerce. So there's this sort of mid-century conundrum of high versus low versus middlebrow cultures, which I see as arising from the rise and inevitable dominance of mass cultures. So as mass communication just kind of takes over everything, you have more of a middlebrow. And that's just a natural occurrence. Now, one thing that really inspired this book was looking at how composers who aspired to write for the concert hall couldn't find work in the concert hall and ended up writing for film and television or easy listening. And somehow in academia and popular culture and fan communities, film music became highly lauded while easy listening became denigrated. And there's actually some people who did studies about this. In the 1970s and 1980s, the social scientist Robert Faulkner wrote these two amazing books, which actually did a lot of the heavy lifting for me, that told me where people worked and how they worked and how their careers were stratified. So just very quickly talking about studio musicians, the stratification of studio musicians had nothing to do with what type of music you played, whether it was a record date, an easy listening date, a jazz date, a TV date, or a film scoring date. No one cared. What mattered to the session players was this: were you first call? Were you a great musician? How much did you get paid? And that was it. Whether or not it was an easy listening date, a record date, or a jingle, that didn't matter. And the other interesting thing that Robert Faulkner studies is composers and how they made their money, and how many composers were actually, I guess, using the word loosely, successful. And it turned out that there's a whole lot of composers that only ever scored one major Hollywood film. And then there's a small group of composers that did more. And the number of composers that were regularly scoring A-list pictures was about 40. This is about the same as today. The number of composers who are regularly scoring A-list pictures is only about 40. So moving on, another thing that I was really interested in was the inception of easy listening and its relation to musical culture, because I believe that easy listening was really nothing new. And it relates to this other interesting paradox of music versus work versus music for pleasure. Excuse me, am I misspeaking? Music for work, music for pleasure. And these have been around for as long as music has been around. And of course, I needed to cite these things. And I was very much interested in this 18th century literature, which was very popular in England, where a lot of people were writing these travelogues of how people played and listened to music in faraway lands such as Italy and Germany and the Netherlands. And these books are really interesting because they kind of show that easy listening existed in the 18th century. So you might have a nice dinner, you might have a court, you might be a king or a duke or an earl, and you got these musicians to play for you while you ate dinner or when you went to bed. So these sort of functions of easy listening, of music for work versus music for pleasure, they go back hundreds of years. And there's these interesting generic similarities between music for work and music for pleasure, which is another item of fascination. Now, this whole thing of music for work is very interesting because mid-century easy listening, as we know it today, traces its roots to a number of things. But one thing that was very interesting was that in 1940, the British War Department was very concerned about production in munitions factory. And the BBC launched this program called Music While You Work, which was intended to boost productivity in munitions factories in Great Britain. And what they found out was that the music that you wanted to have to boost productivity was popular hits that people knew, but you didn't want vocal versions. You wanted instrumental versions so people could sing along or whistle along. And the other interesting thing was they needed to have a certain consistent mood, consistent energy, and consistent volume. And there was a reason for this, which was that in a munitions factory, it's a very noisy environment. And if the music was too quiet, you just lose it. It wouldn't be audible. And of course, if it were too loud, it would distort the tannoys, the speakers. So what they found out was that they wanted music of a consistent volume, consistent energy, that was instrumental and that was popular tunes that everybody knew. And this music while you work, ended up continuing until about 1967. It became a radio program, it became records, and it eventually got taken off the BBC only because they did this weird revamping of the BBC organization. But otherwise, this was very successful. And this started in 1940. And this, you can see it tying to the mid-century easy listening that we all know today. I was also very interested in race and easy listening and these issues of appropriation, cross-pollination, street credibility, and authenticity. And one of the things that was very interesting was that in the 1930s, in the United States, you had this division of the way records were cataloged and sold. And you had general popular music, general music, which included classical and popular music and Tin Pan Alley stuff. And you had race records, which I think everyone knows about, and it's largely African-American or what was called Negro music. And it was a lot of blues and early jazz and things like that. And you had old time records, which was basically an antecedent of country western and hillbilly music. And this tripartite system was highly persistent. And there was this notion of this was how people bought and listened to records that proved fallacious. And whereas some people argued that easy listening is white or is a racist genre or racist format, it can be argued that the rise of easy listening helped break down this tripartite record categorization system. And what was also interesting is that in the 1930s, you had what were known as hot collectors. And the hot collectors were generally young white men who collected these out of print race records from the 1920s. And you have this very interesting feedback loop where these young white men are deciding what records are collectible and what records are the most valuable. And there's this kind of feedback loop of what constitutes authentic jazz, blues, and African-American music that's decided by the wallets of these young white men. And it also plays a part of the breaking down of this tripartite system because it exposes the fact that African Americans didn't buy only race records and white people didn't only buy old time records or general records. And this persisted up through the 50s and 60s where record companies were marketing these records to a certain community. And then the salesmen were noting that, oh, this record is selling pop. And selling pop was an expression that just meant it was selling to white people and we didn't expect that. And that's in the book. But I wanted to discuss that. And the other thing is how this tripartite system and the way people of color are part of easy listening can be seen in the Parker with Strings record, which is a series of sides that Charlie Parker recorded starting in 1949. So in 1949, Charlie Parker starts recording these tunes with strings. He dissolves his bebop group and he goes touring with a string orchestra. And this becomes incredibly influential. And there's just an avalanche of other jazz musicians who put out these with strings records in the ensuing years, which becomes a very big part of easy listening and the easy listening format and formula. And you also have these people that defy these expectations of race and genre, like Quincy Jones and Charles Stepney and Ramsey Lewis. So if I can show you some records. So this is Wally Stote in about 1953. And at this point in time, George Gershwin is like the acceptable emissary for so-called jazz music into easy listening. So you get your George Gershwin, and then as things happen, you get more and more interesting things. Oh, look, Quincy Jones has a travelogue record. How more easy listening can you get than the travelogue genre? And, oh, where is it? Oh, this is really good. So Ramsey Lewis out of Chicago on Argo, and the Chess Brothers owned Argo, which became Cadet, has, this is a whole record of Beatles tunes. And not only that, all the Beatles tunes are from the White Album. So, right. So Ramsey Lewis is recording a Beatles record with chorus and orchestra. And he also does an album of film music with chorus and orchestra on a gatefold with a film theme cover, which is completely easy listening marketing. So you have this jazz artist out of Chicago, who's of course an African-American pianist, and he's making these records that are marketed towards the easy listening thing. And this continues on until you have these really interesting cross-pollinations in the late 60s and early 70s, whereas, you know, with easy listening, you have repertoire and you have genre. So the way you choose repertoire and the way you choose genre is what makes things interesting. So here you have the Cecil Holmes Experience, and he's making a Hollywood hits album, sort of like the Ramsey Lewis record, but this is all blaxploitation. And it's all great music, and it's all performed instrumentally, and it's named after Cecil Holmes, and there's Cecil Holmes on the cover. But here's where it gets really interesting. It's arranged and produced by a white musician called Tony Camillo. And the orchestra is a mix of players, some of which are white, some of which are of color. There's a very famous Hungarian bassist on this record. But things get really muddy when you talk about easy listening being white or milk toast, or however you want to describe it. Things get really complicated because these cross-pollinations are very interesting. And to me, they're really advancing music. They're not the kind of boring thing that you think of easy listening. And also the way easy listening is marketed is widely misunderstood. It's widely presumed that these records were marketed, you know, that's something that mother could put on the hi-fi and listen to while doing dishes. And there may be some of that, but what's very interesting is that they were also marketed to a very broad audience, including teenagers. So this is a magazine that Capitol put out, and if you bought a teen album, which was a certain album that they defined, you could get a free copy of the teen set. And guess who's in the teen set? Why, it's Stu Phillips and the Hollywood Strings. So they are marketing the Hollywood Strings to teenagers, even though Stu Phillips himself said that he had pitched the Hollywood Strings as Beatles for the older set. Now here's another album, another teen magazine, Flip. You guys all remember Flip? And in Flip, why, it's another profile of Stu Phillips. So to me, this was very interesting because it showed the breadth of easy listening. And another thing you had is in the jazz world, you have people like Quincy Jones. Here's Downbeat. And in Downbeat, they're lauding Quincy Jones for his work in Hollywood and living in Beverly Hills. So there's this really interesting thing going on where easy listening sort of defies genre, it defies categorization, and it's bringing in a lot of different people who are all working professionally in music and don't have this kind of judgment about it as being less than concert music or film music or television music or jazz dates or record dates or rock and roll records. And what's even more interesting to me is that a lot of the things that go on in rock and roll, like the harpsichord fetish, come right out of easy listening. And Oh Calcutta and Lawrence Welk and Rosemary Clooney and all this are using harpsichord in 1951 to 1956, well before the Beatles and the Left Bank and a lot of other groups. So those are the big trees that really interested me. I don't want to overdo my time. I'm at 17 minutes now. So maybe now is a good time for me to take a break and you all can ask questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Jack. I'll jump in here. Yeah, you're also hitting home. One of my personal themes has always been what I call junk shop history, the stuff that never makes it into archives, and the histories of I mean, you're sitting in the archive right now, but a vast amount of that is from flea markets, bargain bins, all of these things that you'd be hard pressed to find a flip in an archive somewhere. You have to find it out in somebody's yard before it goes into the trash. So it's histories. We've approached our projects in very complementary ways. I think it was fun to go through your work. So thank you. We both build these arguments about a spectrum of activities between mainstream pop, film soundtracks, easy listening, and other great things going on. Your chapter 4 opens with a rhetorical. You have a number of really sharp rhetorical questions that you start certain chapters with. 4 and 5 I quite like a lot, but 4 you ask, is easy listening a genre or a marketing category? Is it a definable style or an artificial construct? So where do you stand on this now that the project's done? Is it an artificial, useful construct? It's one of these things that, you chart it. You don't spend as much time as, say, I do looking through like the Billboard charts of easy listening, which I'm using to kind of triangulate elements. But you spend any time with those, they're about as reliable as a pre-election poll. Right? They're not, what they're tracking is you're tracking people's ideas of where they hope the industry is supposed to be. It is talked about in the radio columns. It is talked about around those charts, but is it actually a genre? Is it, what is your take on that?
Yeah, that's a really, really interesting question. And as you know, one thing that's really interesting about the charts, and one of the reasons I didn't dwell on the charts too much in the book, except when it supported my arguments, of course, is that, as you know, the charts were constantly shifting and changing their name. So the album starts off where there's a mono album chart and a stereo album chart. And then there's a top 50 album chart. And then there's a top 100 album chart. And then there's an easy listening album chart. And then it becomes adult contemporary. And what I realized, and what I was trying to draw this line from this, 18th century stuff of music in Europe in the 18th century all the way to music today, is that it's just kind of changing its name, and music for work and music for leisure persists. And as I talk about in chapter 8, easy listening persists, and it's just changed its name. So we have vaporwave today, and we have all kinds of stuff. And this album, I love showing this album to people as an example of easy listening today. So Ferranti and Teicher and all, Aldrich and all these like piano people and these piano easy listening albums. Get a load of this. This is
Is
Benny.
it, oh, is it Benny? Yeah.
Okay, this is
my
Benny.
Swedish compatriot.
Yes, Benny Andersson solo piano record playing ABBA hits, solo piano, and it's on Deutsche Grammophon. And this
Is he doing
album,
piano or organ?
no,
or
no,
I
no,
mean, accordion.
it's all solo piano, and it's really
Okay.
good. And it's sort of like the stuff never stopped. It just kind of changed its name. And there's this whole thing that I think Eric brought up in his introductory remarks about Barry White and Love Unlimited and Love's Theme. And it's using a string studio orchestra like you'd put together for any easy listening record. And then it's disco, and then it's not cool. And it's just this weird thing of the way easy listening as a word becomes poison. And I had this with a number of the people I interviewed for my book, like Lee Holdridge, who's like, don't call it easy listening. Don't call it easy listening. Call it orchestral pop. So it doesn't even matter what it is, but there's this weird thing of semantic turnover and what is acceptable to call it and what's not.
Post 1980, absolutely, and then there's the lounge revival, which kind of recalcified it as a concept. Yeah, I have that one at home too, and boy, is it's what whoever decided the canon of it is I really don't know what their system is, but it captures an individual's take in circa 1990s on what easy listening is.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting what happened with the lounge revival and with music like Henry Mancini's Lujan, you know, which Hoover Phonics sampled, and then everyone else samples it, and then you need permission to sample. But there's this period of time in the early 90s where sampling was new and no one was getting clearance. And then you had all these records being sampled.
Sorry, I'm looking at, sorry, I don't know if I should be looking at the chat section. Sorry, it was so fun. I was listening to you, Jack. I was there.
No, that's okay.
It's 11. It's almost midnight here.
So we can answer.
I need to take down my Jackie Gleason album. It's almost midnight. It's on the wall back there. I would think that we should. I've sketched out certain questions, but I think we should open it up here since it's quarter to midnight here in Norwegian time. It sounds almost like a mood album, right?
Yeah. What are the questions?
Yeah, I have a question.
Yeah, I'm gonna call on people as they came up in the chat, if that's okay.
Sounds great.
But I'll get to you. So Chris Malenfi was the first up. Chris, you there?
I am. Hi. Can you all
Hi,
hear me?
Chris.
Hey, everybody. I suppose my question is for John. At least the idea came up while I was listening to John talk.
Mhm.
And perhaps you addressed this in the book. But one topic that's fascinated me for a long time, and I've written about this in my chart columns, is the idea of these Middlebrow lifestyle pop albums as software for hi-fi hardware. You know, if you walk through the Billboard Book of #1 albums, which covers LPs in the so-called rock era, starting with Elvis's first chart topper,
Yeah.
a lot of the albums in that first decade really resemble hi-fi showroom discs. And
Oh,
they copy
absolutely. Absolutely.
Terry
And
Snyder and the All-Stars Persuasive Percussion, Enoch Light's Stereo 35mm. I assume that means 35 millimeter.
The light stuff is amazing. It's this, it you know, it really, in some ways, some of this absolutely parallels the arrival of Technicolor widescreen filmic experience. It's meant to be spectacle. Spectacle is another theme that goes through this, and it becomes sonic spectacle. And certainly Jack can talk about this as well, because it's the art of the arranger, something that's talked about well back into the 20s in popular music jazz circles. but it really, really opens up in that day in ways that have not really been seen around. And it's partly novelty as well. This idea of using the high fidelity spectrum. Alvin Zach does some great work in his "I Don't Sound Like Nobody" 50s, looking at Mitch Miller, right? You know, and the novelty and the use of very basic audio production qualities. But the strings, you know, and orchestral instruments are absolutely part of this. It's the orchestral colors that these massed instruments that have such this, you know, what I chart in the book is just this long history of associations that get mapped onto these massed instruments. Jack emphasizes the idea of, oh, there we go. Yeah, it's like cue up the albums here. Yeah,
right. So there's this whole movement in easy listening that you may have heard this expression, beautiful music in beautiful recordings. And this is sort of this summation of this middlebrow aspiration, both to owning a beautiful hi-fi system and beautiful music and beautiful recordings. And the 35 millimeter is part of that, because 35 millimeter film gave you higher fidelity than quarter-inch film, which was the more common alternative back then as a recording format in those days. But 35 millimeter film gave you a broader, bigger piece of tape that you could coat with, you know, magnetic ferric oxide and make recordings. So there's a whole lot of labels that put out these 35 millimeter recordings, and that was a selling point. If you were one of these people, you bought this expensive hi-fi to show that you had made it and you were keeping up with the Joneses, you know, this was part of the appeal. Beautiful music and beautiful recordings on 35
and the graphics as well. But this is where the software for lifestyle really comes in. It's been gratifying to see a range of scholars, younger scholars, entering work on Middlebrow. There's this forum that paper was part of that I put out. But very early on, I had discussions about them that particularly in the US, I tend to think that most of the evidence points to the thought that not all of this was about high culture. So you look at these sorts of albums, this idea of taking a New Jersey-ish classy really works a lot better for what's happening here in the lifestyle end, right? You know, you get your stereo, it's meant to impress. You have lush sounds emanating from it. I always remember, I think that this was 15 years ago maybe, that I, you know, well before the book was put together, I did something on Sinatra and I talked about the Jackie Gleason stuff. And one senior American scholar who I had no idea had any popular interest comes up to me afterwards and starts telling me about him using the Jackie Gleason albums in the 50s as a freshman, sophomore. I think it was Rich Crawford, if I'm remembering right. Yeah, about using them to don't let that go beyond our little community, but to woo young female peers. You know, and he rattled off a range of adjectives around what this was, and it was not about high culture, but it was about all these associations of glamour and sophistication and the adult life, right, of having martinis and so forth. So yeah, I like the phrase software for lifestyle. We've kind of hit around that. Is there ways we can refine it? Are you yourself refining it as I'm speaking?
No, I wrote about this about a decade ago in my voice column when I was talking about why an album sort of achieves exit velocity at a certain point. At the time, I was writing it about Adele's 21, which
Oh,
at
okay.
first
Yeah,
was
of
driven
course.
by its #1 hits, and it has
Yeah.
legitimate hits on it. But eventually, it became this sort of suburban totem that everybody just kind of needed to own.
Yeah, no, but that's also what, with a lot of the Lux Pop stuff, that's what I'm looking at. And when I tried to make choices of case studies, I really wanted to hit squarely in, top of the charts, mainstream stuff that's everywhere, and try to find context. And this is what it kept pointing to. Not it's interesting because Jack's book goes over a wide range of territory, from banal to really adventurous, the Enoch Light stuff and so forth. You have a framing, Jack, around composers and cultivated or learned or conservatory training, and that's not wrong by any means, but my compliment to this, if you have more time to look through there, is that I tended to focus. I do have my Quincy Jones, right, or who else would I say with there? Pete Rugolo, for example. Pete's over there somewhere on the wall. That has both a vernacular training from working with the big bands, which is the way a lot of the guys that I looked at got their training, is on the job training. They need somebody to put. Jack Nietzsche starts this way before Spector, doing arrangements for R&B groups, right, and ultimately gets strings and builds up an idea for how one works with this, and then ultimately starts having study scores of Berlioz and so forth. You can find this all in his in his private archive, but the stuff that they're putting out, despite, like Spector and Nietzsche, they have all of this rhetoric about Wagnerian symphonics, teenage symphonies, blah, blah, blah. But that's not what the music is, right? It's, in that surf record, the one thing that you can connect to Wagner is the French horn rips that go up, right? But they heard it that way. So there are aspirational elements and programmatic elements that get mapped onto these, but there's a lot of it. It's what I tried to argue, and I would assume Jack sees it in a similar way, is there is a tradition that's being passed between all of these people, regardless of where they're coming up from in training, of this middle music. And they find, Jack does a wonderful job of outlining all of these people that are so skilled that they, regardless of where they got their training, hopping between jobs in Los Angeles and New York. It's a real element, but it's its own tradition, right? Of how you arrange strings that way, right? Do you want to add to this, Jack?
Yeah. There's
guys, I don't want to turn this into a big back and forth off of one question. So I want to get some other people's questions in there. SH Fernando, you had a question.
Yeah, I was wondering if either of you, one thing that attracted me to this type of music was the actual album cover artwork. I mean, the really colorful covers, especially like the Martin Denny records, really exotic, wild images and the colors. And, I used to sample, I'm coming from this from a produced perspective. And John, as you said, a lot of these records were in the dollar bins too.
Oh, so, yeah. That's where you find them now, but
yeah, and that's why I picked them up. And then when I discovered, and I was attracted by the artwork. So I wonder if either of you touch on the artwork of the albums, and if there were people, regular people who did the artwork for these type of albums.
I believe there was, and I do touch on it for the various themes that I look into for like how the music is working. But Jack also talks about this a good amount. Do you want to hop in, Jack?
Yeah, I do. There's a lot of stuff going on with the artwork, and I wanted to circle back to the question that someone asked about using easy listening to seduce your potential lover. And I wanted to show this album artwork. this is the Midnight Strings, and all of their artwork reinforced heteronormativity and heterosexuality. And there's a lot of this in easy listening, whereas people have this sort of notion of easy listening as being this very kind of soft feminine thing with its lush strings. But at the same time, a lot of it is sort of marketed in a way that's intended to appeal to both men and women and to be very sexy. And in my book, there's a lot of talk about the clarifoil album covers that you have with Command Records and the way that references, you know, being successful and having this beautiful gatefold cover. And a lot of the artwork is very kind of misogynistic, and it's a picture of a beautiful woman. And it's, I think there's an example in my book of this album cover, which is taken by a very famous Hungarian photographer. And it's a young woman lying on the beach and the head is chopped off, so you just see her physique. So there's a lot of this really interesting kind of misogyny that goes on in the artwork, and feminization and heteronormativity and things like that, as well as this thing of, like you said, these beautiful album covers, these expensive gatefold covers that are designed to appeal to middlebrow sensitivities.
But you, Jack, I also particularly like there were a lot of smart things that were said in your chapter 5 on no-name, nameless orchestras, and you map this onto I don't know if it's a trifecta or additional parts, but you map out a variety of parts of what's going into these no-name albums and why it all fits together, with album covers being part of that as well.
Yeah, completely. This is one of these no-name groups, the Midnight Strings. I mean, it's really unlikely that you're going to collect the Midnight Strings, although they did put out something like 20 albums. But if you want, you know, a sexy album to seduce your lover with, and well, you know, there you go. You know exactly what you're getting. It's midnight, it's strings. I mean, there's no question of what this is going to sound like. So the cover is a large part of the marketing.
Yeah, I have not looked deeply into. I mean, that would be a fantastic step for somebody to find their way into the market development files of a variety of these artists, because I just like the background string players and pretty much any sidemen on there are not named. I don't recall offhand. I'd have to grab some things on the wall or down below me in my own stack to see if there's photo credits. But my assumption is these are probably coming out of, you know, there's probably an arts world equivalent to a range of these arrangers, people that are equally doing book covers, graphics for films, and so forth within the Hollywood or New York nexus of promotion.
Yeah, I mean,
hey,
I think so.
I'm gonna call on Jody Rosen next to bring us on.
Hi, Jody.
Jody, you still there? Yeah.
Looks like he's typing
okay.
something.
Jody wants me to read his question, so I will. He says, what I was going to say is, where does down-tempo dance music or chill electronica, the various post-trip hop sounds and subgenres that ooze out of the walls of boutique hotel lobbies and upscale boutiques fit into the tradition of luxe pop and easy listening? And relatedly, is it possible beats have supplanted strings as sonic signifiers of luxury or lifestyle in the 21st century?
Absolutely. I think that there are a range of other signifiers that have risen post 1980. This is one reason why I wanted to return to disco, because the more time that I was spending in record world and Billboard and other elements, I couldn't help but notice that there were changes in how glamour was signified in strings. And you also have the rise sample pads, right? So strings are easily accessible by everybody, and to have your 80s band and your sample pad on, or a DX7 string pad come down, it has none of the same signifiers. But when you start to get this DJ culture, I have a couple of friends that have, are my age and, from the 90s forward, were doing chill out sessions and so forth. And they would be rating the easy listening libraries and releases. String samples were very heavy within that. So there, that's one of these areas where the things that we're looking at do retain some sense of elevated signification. But I really think there are other elements that are going along there, because we have different ideas of what glamour becomes, post-punk, right? There's a street glamour. There's other elements that I believe can map between a fashion sense to a sonic sensibility, as well in a range of these in a range of these musics. That said, it's beyond it's beyond what I was doing with Lux Pop. I definitely think that a lot of these genres, knowing the mixtape albums that go out and the graphics that get mapped on to them, that there's a kinship with easy listening. There's a place for this. Jack, do you want to hop in?
Yeah, definitely. That is in chapter 8 of my book. So even though my book is subtitled 1948 to 1978, I trace its antecedents and I trace the stuff that comes after that. So definitely there's this line from studio string orchestras to disco to house music to vaporwave to lo-fi beats for studying. And it's very interesting that, Robert Fink does this whole thing about the record changer and about how, you could listen to music for hours now. And now you can go to YouTube and listen to lo-fi beats for chillaxing and studying for hours and hours as well. There's these channels, and some of them are now even automated with, I guess, some kind of intelligence on Spotify. They have these playlists. You now have playlists that can go on indefinitely with chillaxing house music and lo-fi beats for studying. So yeah, that's chapter 8.
Hollywood itself has mapped on those exact same sounds to these very high-end bachelor pads or bachelorette pads. The sorts of ways that I mapped out these associations beyond just the music itself and then came back to the music itself would be fairly easy to map onto certain sounds from this later music into new ideals of, let's just stick with the bachelor pad idea, but for the moment, it's all over the internet.
We have another question from Matthew Bannister.
Hello, Matthew.
Hello. Yeah, thank you for a fascinating discussion. I just wanted to, a lot of the discussion has been around the sort of progressive aspects of easy listening, whether it's sort of the hi-fi aspect or the progressive soul. I also thought you could ask if you could comment briefly on revivalism in easy listening. I was thinking about, for instance, sort of trad jazz revival in the UK, for example, and the way that sort of antique sort of music sort of becomes sort of, because it's antique, it becomes kind of it becomes sort of
gains an aura,
mainstream, or reappropriated kitsch or whatever.
We're in two different areas here. The progressive sparked certain ideas in me, and then the revivalism sparked other ideas. The one thing that has hung over a couple of the questions, yes, there's been an emphasis on the adventurous side. What we're forgetting then is that Jack avoids, for more interesting angles, avoids, what did you call it? A taxonomy of easy listening, right? And that the book that you held up, just shows how difficult that actually is. And you state quite well, what's most interesting in this is all of these, the how everything collides, right? But what gets lost is there's a lot of this, the earlier stuff, like I had access to Paul Weston's son gave me some of his charts to the early mood music albums, because he comes straight out of the Dorsey tradition, and he comes up with this formula of just the melody, right? And none of that busy improvisation. Slow it down, get some string pads on it. And that's actually how I got into this. I worked as an audio engineer for one of the founders of Apple, Mike Markkula, who loved the Paul Weston stuff. And so I remastered some Paul Weston albums for the guy. But you don't see it. It gets lost in nostalgia, right? That was not something that came up in the lounge revival necessarily, as far as I know. It's been, Jack points out that the majority of what gets has brought attention has been more like the exotica. Even Enoch Light, some of the crazy sound experiments that he was doing hasn't really had a revival there. But I think the closer you get to the Muzak border, the less likely it's going to have a life after its due date. Jack, do you want to jump in on any of those, or take over the revivalism?
Yeah, the one thing that I noticed was that in people that, Simon Reynolds writes this book about retroism, and I was very interested.
Retromania, yeah.
See the omission of lounge music and the lounge music revival, because it proved a lot of his points. But to me, it was another example of how the scholars and the popular press and fan communities tend to ignore mid-century easy listening because it's kind of this weird poison.
Yeah. So in terms of like revivalism, it doesn't. It's very specific in the lounge revival there, and it's also it would be interesting, in the areas that we were talking about earlier of chill out, etc. It would be interesting to actually figure out what samples are being taken from these musics for use. I mean, that's an area that gets lost. It's certainly not mapped out the same way that hip hop websites track out sample use there. For it's much more under the radar for that sort of music, that the DJs that are sampling from these libraries.
I'll come in and ask a final question here, to sort of deal with the music for Middlebrow's week. And you've touched on this in various ways, but it's interesting the way that Jack talks about this kind of functional analysis of music, about music for work and music for pleasure. A lot of the way those categories are defined felt fuzzy to me, but that's interesting. But I think one of the things that easy listening maybe opens up for us a little bit is the way that we use lots and lots of music similarly to these functions of easy listening, and that, music for seduction, rock and roll is music for seduction, like music for relaxation, all kinds of music are music for relaxation. So I just wonder, if you both have thoughts on what people can draw from looking at these genres, and kind of if we can dispel the condescension that we tend to hear in discussion of listeners to easy music, as if they don't like music really, but only like these functions. I just wonder, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
I think, I'm just going to jump in. I think that music in the world of mass cultures is highly cultural. I mean, that's sort of a tautology, but what I'm saying is that you like a piece of music not necessarily because it's this chord progression or this melody. You like it because it's cool and you grew up with it and you have certain resonances and identifications with it. And that's why Easy Listening chose popular song as the melodic material and the basis for the repertoire. And that, to me, is the same thing that's going on in rock and heavy metal and all these other things, that people have an affinity for it because it resonates with them.
I'm not exactly sure what to add here, and I think it's mostly just from it being 12:15. So I'm going to leave it. I'm going to leave it at that, if you don't mind. Yeah.
No problem at all. Yeah.
Apologies. I'm just realizing.
Both in respect to John getting to sleep at a decent time, and because this feels like a good place to wrap up anyway, and we're lots of people are running off to dinner and all of that. I just want to thank John and Jack both for a great session here.